Hey, it's your guy Tyrell back with the interviews. In today's video, we're going to briefly look at the tactical battle between Ancelotti and Mourinho to see how Tottenham were able to defeat Everton. When we break down the game and we do look at the board, we have Everton in more of a 4-4-2, and Spurs started that game in a 4-2-3-1 that conventionally turned into two banks of four out of possession. So when we break down the game, first we'll look at how Spurs look to approach it. And like I said, they dropped off into two banks of four. And what they were looking to do here was that they were looking to have the striker sitting on Andre Gomes to ensure that he couldn't dictate the tempo of the game, but then also apply pressure to Holgate and Keane, have the wider players tuck in a bit narrow but shoot out to the attacking fullbacks in Lucas Digne and Seamus Coleman, and then have the midfield battle set with possibly Winks dropping off a bit deeper to help out the center backs against Calvert-Lewin and Richarlison. However, that shifted due to Everton's overall movement and how they look to approach the game going forward. Ancelotti's midfielders were operating as decoys to get the fullbacks forward, and ultimately their creative play stemmed through the center backs based off the fact that Andre Gomes' passing was inconsistent. When you look at Everton's main route to goal, it was clear as day that they were looking to exploit Serge Aurier, as most teams have done when they've come up against Spurs, and that ultimately shifted how Everton moved across that pitch. What you ended up seeing was that the strikers would drop off of the center backs, and they would look to get the ball in between the gap of Sissoko and Winks, and that was specifically Richarlison. Besides that, you had Andre Gomes holding his position at the center of the pitch, but it was the three other midfielders that shifted their movement. You had Sigurdsson moving into the left half space to drag out Lucas Moura, and that created space for Lucas Digne to push forward and peg back Serge Aurier. But what you also saw down that left-hand side was that Iwobi was dropping off of Serge Aurier and looking to get into that gap between Lucas Moura and Sissoko, and ultimately that did force Sissoko to shift out into that zone. So when you look at that overall left-hand side, it is 3v3, but Everton's main goal was to try and play balls in behind Serge Aurier for Lucas Digne to break in behind. Meanwhile, when we look to the right-hand side, that ultimately shifted Spurs' manner to approach this game defensively, because Tom Davies was consistently dropping off just beyond half into that right half space to get on the ball. But as that game persisted, we consistently saw Son shifting out into that zone to close down Tom Davies in what looked like now a 4-5-1, and that created space for Coleman to push forward and peg back Ben Davies. So as you could see, what Everton were trying to do is that they were trying to get their attacking fullbacks to peg back Spurs' fullbacks and then have them break in behind. So while Everton couldn't create any quality chances down the right-hand side despite the movement of Tom Davies, down the left-hand side they consistently got Digne in behind Aurier, but Aurier did a very good job of negating that threat, and Spurs coped comfortably down that side. On the other hand, Richarlison was a key tactical theme throughout this game, and he was looking to get into the midfield to receive the ball between Sissoko and Winks, or into either side of them. But what ended up happening was that Mourinho did identify the threat of Richarlison running at his defense. So whenever Richarlison did drop off into those midfield zones, he was closed down by Ben Davies, Sissoko, or Winks. So in fear of the threat that Richarlison does pose, Mourinho instructed his midfielders and defense to get tight to Richarlison when he dropped off a bit deeper and ensure that he couldn't break forward, and that often led to multiple tactical fouls. Meanwhile, when we look to Spurs, they came up against an Everton side that dropped off into two banks of four, and what we ended up seeing was that they struggled to create chances in this game, and majority of their attacking moves stemmed through Kane getting Son into good attacking positions. What we ended up seeing from Spurs here was that Winks was dropping off in between those two strikers in Calvert-Lewin and Richarlison and looking to shift to either side of them to get on the ball. But when you look at the other players across that pitch, you end up seeing Sissoko in a battle with Sigurdsson, and then you end up having Lucas Moura dropping off. Lucas Moura was dropping off ahead of Lucas Digne, so there was times where you ended up seeing Sigurdsson blocking off the passing lane into Lucas Moura and tracking the movement of Sissoko ahead of him. And if at times we did see Lucas Moura drop off deeper, then Sigurdsson would shift over into his path. Likewise, we ended up seeing Everton at times shift into more of a 5-3-2 out of possession, and that was based on the attacking positioning of Serge Aurier. Iwobi did a very good job of ensuring that Serge Aurier didn't cause any sort of threat down that right-hand side, and that saw saw the Everton backline shift across. Down that left-hand side, early on in that game, we would see Richarlison drop off a bit deeper to close down Ben Davies. And that's because Tom Davies was covering the positioning of Lo Celso, especially when Son would shift out into that left touchline zone, and that would allow Coleman to stick out to him. There were times where Lo Celso did shift central, but then they could have Andre Gomes pick him up. But as you could see, Everton were organized and disciplined when Spurs were trying to break them down in open play. And like I said, a lot of their attacking moves came through Harry Kane in a deeper position, getting teammates into good positions, and it often led with Son breaking forward into that final third. But the problem that Spurs encountered was that whenever Son got into those attacking zones, he was often blocked out by several Everton players, sometimes 3 or 4, tracking his movement, and ultimately he was lacking support in those zones. Luckily for them, in the build-up to their fortuitous goal, it did involve Son closed down by multiple Everton players, but he was able to squeeze a pass into Kane, and that ultimately led to Lo Celso firing an effort off Keane. So when we look to the second half, we did see Ancelotti bring on Gordon for Iwobi. That ended up seeing Tom Davies move into midfield and Sigurdsson move to the left. And what we ended up seeing now was that you ended up having Gordon trying to receive the ball in the gap between Son and Winks. You saw Richarlison consistently dropping off deeper between Winks and Sissoko, and then you witnessed Sigurdsson drop off into that gap between Sissoko and Lucas Moura. Mourinho also made a slight adjustment, moving Lo Celso into that central role and pulling out Son to the left-hand side. And the reason behind that was that he wanted Son to track the movement of Coleman that was pushing forward on a consistent basis. And what we saw in the opening minutes was that both managers making those tactical adjustments nearly led to an Everton goal. You had Kane swarming Andre Gomes and Lo Celso right ahead of him, and Gomes was able to split those two to find Tom Davies, who took his touch across Lucas Moura, and when Gordon received that ball in between Son and Winks, he fired a low shot on goal. However, while Everton's start to the second half was promising, it was Spurs who got into the more advanced areas and frankly possibly should have doubled their lead in that second half. Initially, what we ended up seeing was that they looked to play balls over the top, and in a 2-minute span, it was Toby Alderweireld on 2 separate occasions playing diagonal balls over the top of that Everton defense, the first time finding Son darting in between Mina and Coleman, and Mina let the ball drop and Son forced Pickford into a save, and seconds later he tried the same thing but finding Kane darting in between the center backs, but Keane did a good job of clearing those lines. Lastly, the focus that we're going to look on here is Harry Kane. While he was often isolated and didn't receive much service in and around that penalty box, he was involved in Tottenham's best attacking moves throughout that game and frankly placed his teammates in some quality positions that they should have maximized. And you end up seeing Kane receive that ball closed down by Coleman and Keane, and he has a passing lane into the path of Lo Celso, but what he ends up doing is that he plays a difficult pass to split those two players to find Son breaking free, and then Son's able to play Lo Celso into that left channel that results in Holgate being booked to prevent Lo Celso from breaking free on goal. Later on, you end up seeing Dyer being pressed by Richarlison, and he ends up clearing his lines to find Kane dropping off, and he ends up clipping a first-time flick in between Tom Davies and Yerry Mina into the path of Lo Celso, and following the introduction of Bernard for Sigurdsson, we ended up seeing Lucas Moura wrap a ball across Andre Gomes into the path of Kane dropping off the center backs. Once again, Kane does a very good job of linking play with Lo Celso, and that ultimately places Lo Celso in a position in that midfield to slide the ball between Gordon and Coleman for Son. But as you can see, while you can say that Ancelotti had more attacking ideas to break in beyond that Spurs backline, Mourinho deserves credit and won the tactical battle here based off the fact that he nullified those threats. What you ended up seeing from Spurs was that yes, Ancelotti did a very good job of crowding out Son, but Spurs were still able to score, and then they were able to get into better attacking positions by getting Harry Kane involved. What you saw from Mourinho though was that he was able to limit that threat that Ancelotti tried to create by attacking Aurier, and he ensured that Richarlison couldn't have an impact on the game, and that's why Spurs and Mourinho deserve credit. Hi everybody, thanks for watching and subscribe here for your latest tactical analysis and daily commentary on the interview show. And if that wasn't enough, don't forget you could find more organic, unfiltered soccer/football analysis on the Interviews podcast, the best soccer/football podcast in the world, available on iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and any Android apps on your Android devices.